In May of 1908, Charlie McLeod and 5 others pushed a canoe into one of the river's narrow corridors and watched daylight grow thin. Not because the sun was setting, but because the canyon walls were rising. Wind came down those rock faces with an indifferent force, flattening the surface of the water in one moment, then whirring it into chop the next. High above the riverline, openings punctured the cliffs, caves like dark mouths, too distant to reach, too dark to read. They were passing through a place that felt less like a landscape and more like a threshold. Charlie was not in that canyon for the view. He was there because the valley had taken his brothers. For nearly 3 years, no one outside the Nahanni had heard from Willie McLeod, Frank McLeod, or the third man who went in with them, Robert Weir. The silence had been the first cruelty. The second would be what the river finally allowed people to see. When the canoe slipped into a wider pocket near the edge of a canyon stretch, just enough shoreline to land, the party noticed the shape of a tent lodged among trees. They pulled in, boots sinking into mud and wet grass, and the wind seemed to pause just long enough for the mind to register what lay ahead. A body outside the tent. Burned clothing clinging to bone, an arm stretched as if toward something it could not reach, a rifle propped against a tree just beyond that final, futile extension of muscle and intention. And when they moved around the tent flap and pulled back a blanket half covering the second figure, the valley answered their questions with a kind of brutal restraint. There were no heads, no gold, no clear story. Only the faintest human sentence carved nearby. We have found a fine prospect, as though the men had tried to leave behind an entry in a ledger that the wilderness could not erase. The Royal Northwest Mounted Police would later put forward a clean explanation. Starvation or exposure, then scavenging animals carrying off skulls. Charlie would refuse to accept it. The public, reading the early reports and trading the story between settlements, would refuse in their own ways too, by naming the place and warning their children about it, by turning the Nahanni into a superstition with coordinates. That is what makes the Nahanni story linger. Not because the valley is haunted in the simple sense, but because a pattern seems to form there, repeating with variations. Fire, absence, missing heads, missing gold. The wind tightening in the canyons as if the river itself is turning a page. The question that holds the whole account together is not only what happened to Willie and Frank McLeod. It is why the Nahanni, again and again, appears to collect the same kind of ending and return it without an explanation. Within that already hazardous world, there is a stretch that has been spoken of with a particular wariness. The Nahanni Valley region around the South Nahanni River and its features, including the canyons that pinch the water into dark corridors. One area, known in later lore as Deadmen Valley and linked to names like Headless Creek and the Headless Range, acquired its reputation not from a single event, but from the way certain events seem to echo each other. Long before outsiders put their own fears onto it, indigenous oral traditions in the region carried stories about dangers in the valley, warnings about the land, about spirits, about beings and threats that did not fit neatly into a newspaper account. Names like the Naha appear in those traditions and in later retellings. A people said to have vanished, leaving shelter and supplies behind as if removed overnight. Stories of white demons or powerful creatures in the forest. Legends of wolves called wahilas. Some of this belongs to folklore, some to the way caution is encoded across generations in places where the environment can kill the careless. But the Nahanni's modern reputation did not grow solely from legend. It grew from bodies. It grew from absence. It grew from the way official explanations often sounded tidy against a backdrop that did not feel tidy at all. In 1904, three brothers, Willie McLeod, Frank McLeod, and Charlie McLeod, decided to go looking for gold in the Nahanni. They lived in the Northwest Territories, a region already familiar with the logic of risk. Gold in that era did not simply promise wealth. It promised a kind of escape from hard lives and thin margins. And the Nahanni, scarcely traveled by outsiders, carried the most intoxicating version of that promise. If the valley had been ignored, then any riches it held might still be untouched. The journey in was not simple. It was a chain of difficult travel. Sled dogs, trains, homemade boats. It was the kind of expedition where every mile cost something. Time, food, muscle, luck. By the time the brothers slipped into the valley and found themselves on a river running through the center of that wilderness, they had already paid enough that turning around empty-handed would have felt like an embarrassment carved into memory. The river they were on is often referred to in these accounts as the Flat River, an ironic name, because sections of it behave less like a flat waterway and more like a set of rapids waiting to break a craft apart. But the brothers pushed along it anyway, pulled off onto a bank at one point, and made camp. Then they set up their sluices in the river, long, narrow boxes meant to strain gold from sediment. The method is simple, almost humble. Place the sluice in moving water, shovel riverbed material through it, let the lighter debris wash away, while heavier particles settle into riffles. It is slow work. It demands patience and repetition. And then, in the way gold stories often begin, the river appeared to reward them quickly. They hit pay dirt. For a time, the work became frantic. When gold shows itself early, it changes the tempo of a camp. Hands move faster. Sleep becomes optional. Hunger becomes background noise. Hope becomes a kind of fever. Accounts of this first McLeod trip emphasize that they gathered large amounts, enough that their containers were filled, enough that the brothers decided to go home and secure what they had, then return. That decision, leave now, come back later, is one of those small, ordinary pivots that can later look like fate, because the Nahanni does not care about plans. Early in the journey out, the brothers' boat capsized. In the strength of the current, the craft broke apart and sank. Supplies went down with it. The gold went down with it. For a long moment, the only victory in the scene was that the men themselves survived. They managed to get to shore with a rifle and whatever else they could salvage, some lumber, some mining equipment. They were devastated. But they were alive, and in places like this, survival itself becomes a kind of currency. The brothers decided to do what people in remote country often do when luck turns: improvise and keep moving. They used recovered lumber and cut down trees. They fashioned another boat. They went back upstream to the original site, as if returning to the place where fortune had shown its face might coax it back. This time, the river gave them nothing. They worked a full day and found no more gold. They slept with disappointment settling over camp like damp. The next morning, they packed up, got on their new boat, and made their way out of the valley and back home. That should have been the end of it. An expensive lesson about risk, a story to tell, perhaps a warning to younger men tempted by the same lure. But the Nahanni had already done something important. It had proven to Willie and Frank that gold existed there. Once that certainty takes root, it is difficult to kill. People can accept that luck is fickle. They have a harder time accepting that a proven prospect should be abandoned. Willie and Frank wanted to go back. Charlie wanted the gold too, but he had felt the river's appetite when the boat flipped. For him, the threshold had already exacted a price. He refused to return. So in 1905, Willie and Frank prepared for another expedition, this time with a third man, Robert Weir, a friend who would take Charlie's place. They went into the valley, and then they entered the largest and most corrosive element of the Nahanni story, the long silence after a departure. They did not tell anyone precisely how long they would be gone. In that era, such vagueness was not unusual. Men disappeared into wilderness for seasons and returned with beards, stories, and sometimes money. The absence of letters or messages did not immediately indicate death. In some cases, it indicated the opposite, success so rich that returning felt unnecessary, at least for a while. Weeks became months. Months became a year. Still no word. Charlie remained calm longer than most would have. He told others what he wanted to believe. The men were experienced. There was gold. 3 men together could handle the country. Perhaps they had decided to stay through a summer, maybe longer. A second year passed. At that point, belief becomes harder to maintain without turning into denial. Even in the early 1900s, even in remote regions, 2 years without contact from a party that should have crossed paths with someone. Traders, other prospectors, settlements was not normal. Charlie decided that the ledger of silence had to be confronted directly. He gathered 4 men from his town and organized a search expedition into the Nahanni. Among those often associated with this search are names that recur in the Nahanni's later lore: Pool Field and Sergeant Joy of the Royal Northwest Mounted Police, along with others like Danny McLeod and members of the Lafferty family. Whether every retelling aligns perfectly on the roster, the point remains. This was not a casual outing. It was a deliberate return to a place already known to be dangerous, driven by family obligation and the stubborn human refusal to accept uncertainty as a final answer. They traveled in, endured the same arduous approach, and eventually reached the rivers that would guide them deeper, the Flat River and the larger South Nahanni system. They moved upstream, scanning both sides of the water for signs of life, for smoke, for cut timber, for a campfire ring, anything that would suggest 3 men were alive and working. At first there was nothing, and then the river led them into the canyons. The South Nahanni's canyon stretches are often described in a way that makes the river seem like an intelligent corridor. Walls tightening and loosening, turns that hide what comes next, wind that changes temperature and sound. One bend in particular, the Big Bend, is remembered because of how it shifts the experience of traveling the river. After that turn, the river runs into a section often described as Second Canyon, where the cliffs are sheer and close, the shoreline thin, and the sunlight less reliable. In that stretch, the party would have felt boxed in, water below, cliffs above, and very few options for escape if anything went wrong. It is not the sort of place where a person can calmly pull over and rest. It is a place that demands passage. As they moved through the canyon's cave openings, some high, some low, would have been visible. Dark hollows in rock, impossible to see into, difficult to reach. It is easy to understand why later retellings talk about feeling watched there. The environment itself creates that sensation. But the search party was not there for atmosphere. They were there for evidence. Near the end of that canyon stretch, where the shoreline widened enough to land and trees returned closer to the water, they saw it. A tent tucked among branches. The sight of a tent in a place like that's a shock, because it is an unmistakable sign of human intent. Someone chose to stop here, chose to stay, chose to make this narrow strip of land into a temporary home. They pulled the canoe in, they stepped out, and they saw the bodies. 2 men, burned clothing, decomposition. One body lying outside the tent, one half in and half out. A blanket partially obscuring the second. And when the blanket was moved, the most important detail presented itself in the simplest possible way. The heads were gone. The search party did what people do when faced with a scene that refuses to explain itself. They looked for missing pieces. They searched the area for skulls, for signs of struggle, for footprints, for anything that might allow a story to form. No heads were found. But personal effects, items in pockets, possessions in the tent, allowed identification. These were Willie and Frank McLeod. The third man, Robert Weir, was not present. Later, a partial skeleton would be found downriver and attributed to Robert in some accounts, though not with complete certainty. This uncertainty becomes part of the Nahanni's enduring unease. The valley does not merely kill, it blurs. Among the objects and signs around the camp, one detail gained a life beyond its physical simplicity. A carved message in a tree. The words are repeated in many tellings. "We have found a fine prospect." It reads like triumph and warning at the same time. It suggests the men found something worth noting. Gold, perhaps? It also suggests they had time to carve the message, which implies a moment of calm before whatever came next. And yet, in the camp, there was no gold visible. None on the bodies, none stored nearby, none in the immediate riverbed. If the men had truly struck it rich, the money was absent. So the valley had offered up 2 corpses and a sentence, and had withheld everything else. Charlie and the party left the valley and reported what they found. The Mounties came. An investigation was conducted. And eventually, an official conclusion was offered that satisfied paperwork, if not imagination. The men had likely died from starvation or exposure. After death, animals had removed the heads. The third man, Robert Weir, had either died elsewhere and been scavenged too, or had disappeared in the same manner. Charlie rejected that conclusion. He suspected the men had been attacked, possibly by indigenous people in the area. The police did not accept that claim. In the absence of clear evidence, the official narrative remained natural tragedy, followed by natural scavenging. That would have been an ending if the Nahanni had allowed endings to stay put. Instead, the McLeod discovery became the opening chapter in a longer pattern. The story traveled. It moved through northern communities and through southern newspapers that treated remote wilderness like a stage for fear. People who had never seen the Nahanni began to imagine it. The place acquired names that sounded like a verdict. Deadmen Valley, Headless Creek, Headless Range, Funeral Range. The geography itself became a warning sign. For a time, prospectors hesitated. The idea of gold could not be killed, but it could be delayed by a strong enough dread. The Nahanni was already difficult to reach. Now it was also infamous. And then, as always happens with forbidden places, someone decided that fear was merely a story other people told. In the years that followed, a sequence of events accumulated, some well documented, some resting in the uncertain ground between record and retelling, but together forming the shape of a grim refrain. The first major echo often attached to the McLeod story centers on a prospector named Martin Jorgensen. Accounts vary on the exact year of his death, some placing it in 1913, others more commonly around 1917. But the shape of the event remains strikingly familiar. Jorgensen went into the Nahanni to prospect. He established a base. Reports describe a one-room cabin built near the river. He communicated outward, sending word to partners that he had done well, that he had found gold, that the trip had been worth the risk. Then he failed to meet his partners at the expected rendezvous. When others went in to find him, they found what was left of his cabin, burned down, torched, reduced to ash and char. And near the cabin lay Jorgensen's remains. In the versions that made the strongest impression on the public, the same detail appears again. His head was missing. And again, the gold he had claimed to have found was not there. The police investigated. They did not publicly connect his death to the McLeod's deaths as a single case. The official stance leaned toward separate incidents, separate accidents, the valley simply being dangerous. But official separation does not stop the human mind from linking patterns. People did the arithmetic anyway. Headless men, burned structures, missing gold, the same valley. By the early 1920s, the Nahanni had become more than a cautionary tale. It had become a kind of test of luck, of courage, of greed, of belief. Around 1922, another incident joined the ledger. The death of a man named John O'Brien. The details of O'Brien's end are remembered less for brutality and more for their strange stillness. He was found in winter conditions, dead from exposure. But what unnerved witnesses and later readers was his posture. How little it suggested struggle. In some tellings, he was found near the remains of a fire, matchbook still clutched in rigid fingers. In others, he was hunched over tinder, as if caught mid-task. The impression remains the same. He looked as if he had been stopped in an instant, flash frozen, like a man who had not even understood he was dying. The police response again leaned toward the practical. Freezing to death can happen quickly in certain conditions, especially when someone is exhausted, alone, wet, injured, or simply unlucky. Posture can be misleading. Death can arrive without drama. And yet, the Nahanni does not simply produce deaths. It produces scenes that feel staged by accident, arranged by circumstance into something that resembles a message. By 1926, the ledger gained another kind of entry, an absence rather than a body. A hunting party traveled into the Nahanni region. Among them was a young woman named Annie Lafferty, sometimes remembered as May Lafferty in other retellings, the name shifting like so many details do in this valley's oral afterlife. The party camped near the Flat River, within the area associated with the Headless reputation. That night, the group rested, joked, settled into the familiar routines of wilderness travel. A camp is a fragile island of human order. Firelight, sleeping rolls, quiet talk, a perimeter drawn more by habit than by fence. In the morning, Annie was gone. At first, the search would have been practical, calling her name, checking the riverbank, scanning for footprints, assuming she had stepped away to relieve herself or fetch something. But the valley does not allow long optimism. The longer the party looked, the more the absence hardened into dread. They searched the immediate vicinity, then wider. They found no sign that satisfied the mind, no clear trail, no body. They left the valley to get help. Authorities and searchers came. Annie was never found. Months later, another piece of the story surfaced, one that would become in later years among the most unsettling images attached to the Nahanni. A man often referred to in retellings simply as Charlie, distinct from Charlie McLeod, reported that he had been camped in the area that night, near the river, within earshot of the hunting party, though not part of it. In the dark hours, he woke to the sound of small rocks falling into water. Not the heavy crash of a landslide, but the repeated clatter of stones, enough to catch the ear and sharpen the nerves. He looked across the river. Moonlight gave the trees thin shape. He listened. Then he saw movement through sparse timber. A naked woman, pale against the dark, running on all fours up a mountainside. As she moved, her hands and feet dislodged stones that rattled down into the river. Halfway up the slope, she stopped and turned, and for a moment her face was visible. In his account, the face did not look simply frightened. It looked wrong, possessed, altered, beyond ordinary panic. The witness ducked down and did not follow. He made a choice that later readers often judge harshly until they imagine the scene. A lone person in a dark valley, seeing a naked figure moving like an animal, and feeling that approach would not lead to rescue, but to contagion, of fear, of danger, of something unnamed. When authorities later showed him a description of Annie, he believed the woman he saw matched. By the time he reported this, months had passed. Annie was presumed dead. The story did not lead to recovery. It became another entry in the Nahanni ledger. A person went missing, and the valley returned only a moment of nightmare. By the early 1930s, the Nahanni's reputation was established enough that anyone who went in was doing so with knowledge of what had happened before, and still men went. In 1931, a prospector named Phil Powers traveled into the valley and built a cabin off the river. Cabins in that country are declarations. A person intends to stay through weather, to live long enough in one place to make labor worth it. Powers did not stay long. His cabin burned to the ground with him inside. His skeleton was intact, unlike the headless bodies that haunted the earlier headlines, but questions formed around the fire. In some retellings, the origin point suggested the roof, raising the unsettling possibility that if the fire began above, Powers might have had time to escape, unless he was already dead or incapacitated before flames took hold. Again, officials leaned toward accident. Stovepipes, stray embers, dry timber, the simple physics of fire meeting a small structure in a cold land. But in a valley already soaked in rumor, accident did not feel like explanation. It felt like a label slapped over a wound. In 1936, two more prospectors, William Epler and Joseph Mulholland, entered the region to try their luck. They established a cabin, settled in, began work. Then they vanished. A search party eventually found their cabin burned to the ground, but the men were not in the ashes. There were no bodies nearby. There was no clear trail out, and the fire's cause was unknown. This is where the Nahanni's pattern begins to feel less like a series of isolated tragedies and more like an escalation loop. The same elements repeating, changing order, changing victims, but maintaining a shape. Fire without a clear cause. Absence where bodies should be. The land refusing to provide a clean line between life and death. Then in 1945, the valley produced another of its starkest images. A prospector named Ernest Savard went into the area and failed to meet an intended rendezvous. Searchers found him in a sleeping bag near the flat river, dead, and again, his head was missing. Officials suggested the same mechanism, death from hypothermia or starvation, followed by scavenging animals that removed the skull and carried it off. In wilderness environments, this can happen. Predators and scavengers often target softer tissue. A skull can be dragged away and never found. And yet, by this point, repetition becomes its own form of evidence. Not evidence of a particular culprit, but evidence that something about the Nahanni's combination of terrain, isolation, and human behavior produces the same kind of ending more often than most people can tolerate believing. 1 year later, in 1946, another disappearance reinforced the valley's hold on the public imagination. A miner named John Patterson traveled into the region and vanished. His partner, Calgary geologist Frank M.W. Henderson, returned from the valley reporting Patterson missing. The two had arranged a rendezvous point near Virginia Falls, an imposing landmark within the park, and a simple message system. Whoever arrived first would leave a note on a known tree. Henderson arrived, left his message, traveled on, and returned weeks later to find no reply from Patterson. He waited with his party. Days passed. And then, one night, Henderson's camp was disturbed by something that has become one of the Nahanni's enduring motifs: the warning of white figures. Members of Henderson's group, indigenous packers traveling with him, woke him and warned that pale figures were moving along the valley. Henderson argued for a natural explanation, suggesting the aurora's reflection or some optical effect. The argument did not matter. The fear had already crossed the threshold from suggestion into certainty for those who felt it. The group left soon after. Patterson was never found. That night in the valley took on additional weight in later retellings because it combined so many of the Nahanni's elements at once: disappearance, warning, the sensation of being watched, sound carrying through darkness, the wind in the canyon, and a sudden sense that the land itself was hostile, not in the way weather is hostile, but in the way territory can feel hostile when a person realizes they are not wanted. Reports describe the night filled with distant howls and wailing, sounds not heard on previous nights, sounds that seemed to ring the camp from multiple directions. Whether those sounds were wolves, wind, birds, or something else, the effect was the same. The search party felt pushed out. In the years after the mid-1940s, fewer such incidents circulated widely. That decrease can be read in two ways. One possibility is simple. Fewer people went in. Fear works eventually. So does the slow tightening of regulations, the reality that the Nahanni is not easily reached, the increasing cost of risking a life for gold or reputation. Another possibility, one that the valley's most devoted believers prefer, is that whatever the Nahanni does became quieter, not kinder. By the time the Nahanni became formally protected, its nickname had already been secured by story and repetition. The crack in the official narrative is not a single contradiction. It is the accumulation of similar contradictions. If the McLeod brothers died from starvation or exposure, why were their bodies burned? If Jorgensen died by accident, why was his cabin burned down? If fires were common accidents, why do they so often appear alongside disappearances and missing heads? If missing skulls are the work of animals, why do so many of the men associated with rich prospects also leave behind missing gold? Each question can be answered on its own with a plausible mechanism. The problem is that the Nahanni stacks them. It repeats combinations. It produces the same uneasy flavor of ending. It begins to feel less like a series of unrelated tragedies and more like a pattern that forms because the valley is built to allow it. Isolation, rough terrain, delayed discovery, and the long gap between a person vanishing and anyone reaching the spot where they vanished. That delay matters because the wilderness edits scenes. Fire collapses structures. Weather erases tracks. Animals scatter remains. Rivers move objects miles away. The Nahanni does not preserve evidence. It degrades it. So when officials arrived after the fact, the clearest narrative they could offer was often the one that required the fewest additional assumptions: exposure, starvation, accident, scavenging. And for any single case, that narrative might be correct. But the valley's reputation exists because the repetition makes those simple stories feel insufficient. The most honest way to approach the Nahanni's mystery is to accept that the valley may not have one answer. It may have a set of conditions that repeatedly produce the same kind of outcome. The Nahanni's geography and remoteness create a perfect environment for ambiguity. A person can die from exposure within hours under the wrong conditions, especially if wet, exhausted, injured, or alone. A small miscalculation, choosing the wrong river crossing, failing to dry clothing, underestimating wind, can turn fatal before the mind has time to dramatize what is happening. Death by cold can be quiet. It can look, to an outsider, like a person simply stopped. A body left in the open can be altered rapidly by scavengers. Predators can remove parts that seem gruesome and deliberate to human eyes. Heads, in particular, can be taken. A skull can be dragged away into brush or dens and never recovered. That mechanism, death first, scavenging second, can account for missing heads without requiring a human attacker. Fire, too, can be mundane. In small cabins built quickly from the local timber, with improvised stoves and stovepipes, a single spark can become a roof fire. A person can be trapped if smoke fills a small space fast enough, or if the person is asleep, ill, intoxicated, or already weakened. A cabin can burn completely in a short time, leaving only the simplest impression: ash and unanswered questions. And yet the Nahanni story does not feel resolved by those mechanisms because of two repeating details that sit like splinters in the narrative: burned scenes and missing gold. The McLeod camp is the first major example. Two men found decapitated and burned with a rifle just out of reach and a carved message claiming a fine prospect, yet no gold present. One can imagine multiple possibilities without proving any. It is possible that Willie and Frank did strike gold and then lost it, washed away, hidden and forgotten, scattered in panic. It is possible they cached it elsewhere and died before retrieving it. It is possible they exaggerated their prospect in optimism or desperation, carving bravado into a tree as a kind of reassurance for anyone who might find them later. It is also possible that if gold was present, another human being took it, whether Robert Weir or someone else entirely. That is the darker human theory that has haunted these stories: theft and murder. The Nahanni's remoteness would make it possible for violence to occur without immediate consequence. A killer could disappear into the valley's distances. Evidence would degrade. Bodies would be discovered late, altered by animals and weather. In such a setting, a human crime could easily be mistaken for natural tragedy. Some have focused suspicion on Robert Weir precisely because he was the third man and the only one not definitively recovered. In that framing, Weir murders the brothers, takes the gold, and vanishes. But even this theory sits on soft ground because Weir, too, is an absence rather than a confirmed survivor. A partial skeleton attributed to him complicates any attempt to cast him cleanly as culprit. The valley's habit of blurring remains makes certainty expensive. Another human theory places blame on unknown attackers, either outsiders, rivals, or indigenous groups. Charlie McLeod himself leaned toward this, believing his brothers were attacked. But belief is not proof. Without clear forensic evidence, without eyewitnesses, and with a scene already degraded, such claims remain part of the valley's folklore more than its confirmed record. Then there is the possibility that the Nahanni's pattern is less about a singular force and more about compounding misfortune. Men drawn in by rumors of gold, staying longer than is safe, pushing deeper into dangerous terrain, building cabins quickly, relying on fire and fragile equipment, and becoming vulnerable to the same environment in similar ways. A prospector's life in the Nahanni would have been a long conversation with hunger, weather, and isolation. The valley punishes arrogance and rewards caution only until it doesn't. Men who go in confident, determined not to be scared off by stories, may take risks that sober judgment would reject. This becomes especially plausible when considering why the most dramatic incidents cluster around prospectors and trappers. People who deliberately enter deep wilderness alone or in small parties, often in winter conditions, often far from help. The white figure's warning in 1946 illustrates another component that can turn wilderness into something that feels supernatural. Fear's ability to sharpen perception and distort it at the same time. In a place where the aurora can paint the sky and throw pale light across snow and rock, where mist can turn into moving shapes, where wind can become voices in narrow corridors, it would not be difficult for a camp already saturated in dread to interpret natural phenomena as threatening presences. This does not mean the warning was false. It means the valley is capable of producing experiences that feel like a haunting even without an external actor. Still, the Nahanni story refuses to settle because it contains a few scenes that feel like more than accident. The McLeod brothers' final positions, one reaching, one half out of the tent, create the impression of sudden alarm. The rifle propped just out of reach feels like a last attempt. The carved message suggests calm before rupture. Jorgensen's burned cabin and missing head repeats the same visual language. Epler and Mulholland's burned cabin without bodies adds a vanish and fire combination that is difficult to shrug off emotionally, even if it could be explained by accident and subsequent movement. And Annie Lafferty's disappearance, paired with the image of a naked woman fleeing on all fours, adds a human horror that does not need a supernatural explanation to be terrifying. Something happened to a person that made her run from her own camp into wilderness at night, without clothes, as if escaping something worse than death by cold. The Nahanni's power lies in that uncertainty. Each explanation is plausible. None are definitive. The valley becomes, in effect, an environment where multiple tragedies can occur, and where the evidence required to resolve them is systematically destroyed by time and terrain. So the Nahanni's mystery may not be one mystery. It may be a corridor where greed meets danger, where isolation meets the worst human instincts, where accident and violence can wear similar masks because the land erases the difference. The valley does not need a monster to create monster stories. It only needs distance, weather, fire, and time. In later decades, the Nahanni's reputation did not disappear. It evolved. The region became protected, formalized, mapped, administered. Nahanni National Park Reserve was established in the early 1970s. It gained international recognition in 1978. Its boundaries expanded again in 2009. These milestones reflect not only the beauty of the place, Virginia Falls, vast canyons, wilderness that remains nature at its purest in the eyes of those who go, but also an acknowledgement that the Nahanni is not a casual destination. Even now, the park is not a simple family stop. It is remote. Access is limited. Much of it is reached only by plane or boat, and travel through it remains demanding. Certain areas are restricted or closed, often for ecological and cultural protection, because the park's purpose is preservation, not convenience. But among those who keep the valley's older stories alive, closures carry a different meaning. They become another form of speculation, another shadow on the ledger. Maybe the restrictions are not only to protect the land from people, but to protect people from the land. That kind of thinking is difficult to disprove because it cannot be tested without crossing into the very risk the stories warn against. And in the Nahanni, risk is never theoretical. It is physical. It is cold. It is the wind funneling through stone. It is the river insisting on movement. It is fire in a timber cabin. It is the long, slow theft of certainty. From the mid-1940s onward, fewer famous incidents circulate, but the valley never becomes ordinary. The names remain. Deadmen Valley remains on the tongue like a warning. Headless Creek remains a line on a map that reads like a headline. The idea of a lost McLeod mine continues to haunt prospectors and storytellers alike, a legend of gold that may or may not exist, but which has already extracted its price in the form of lives and vanishings. And so, the Nahanni persists as a place where beauty and dread coexist without canceling each other. A place where the most frightening element is not a creature in a cave, but the knowledge that the valley does not owe anyone an answer. In the end, the South Nahanni keeps doing what it has always done, flowing through stone, through shadow, through silence, carrying forward an old, unfinished accounting, one entry at a time, and leaving behind only what it chooses to leave behind. This was Midnight Horror Society, dark curiosity for sleep. Until your next midnight session, sleep well.